When a billionaire tried to take away a maid's only home, no one expected her teenage son to stand in court. But the words he spoke that day shook the entire courtroom and even left the judge in tears. The marble floors of the courthouse echoed with the sound of heavy shoes, the kind that belonged to men in polished suits, men who carried themselves with confidence born from wealth and power. Among them stood Alexander Grant, one of the wealthiest billionaires in the city, his cold eyes scanning the room with a detached indifference. For him, this was just another legal battle, another step in securing his empire. To everyone else, it was a spectacle the powerful Alexander Grant, facing off against his longtime maid, a quiet black woman named Grace, who had cleaned his mansion for nearly 2 decades. Grace sat in the back row of the courtroom, her shoulders hunched, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Years of silent labor had hardened her skin, but not her heart. She had once been invisible in the halls of Alexander's mansion, moving quietly from room to room, picking up after his careless luxury. But today, for the first time in her life, the world's gaze had turned toward her. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was the woman who dared to stand against a billionaire. The case was about property, or so it seemed on the surface. Grace lived in a small cottage on the edge of Alexander's estate, a place granted to her years ago when her husband passed away. It was meant to be her shelter, a roof over her head while she raised her only son, Isaiah. But now Alexander wanted it back. He claimed it was part of his land, and he wanted it demolished to build another wing of his mansion. To him it was nothing more than a piece of dirt. To Grace it was home. As the judge entered, the courtroom settled into silence. Lawyers prepared their notes, and cameras flashed from the back benches where the press waited eagerly. For the world, this was about power versus poverty, wealth versus survival. But beneath the surface, a deeper story was waiting to emerge, one that not even Alexander could predict. Grace's son Isaiah sat beside her. He was only 16, tall for his age, but with eyes that carried a depth of maturity far beyond his years. Those eyes had watched his mother work day and night, watched her sacrifice meals so he could eat, watched her patch-torn shoes with thread while smiling as if it was enough. He had grown up in the shadow of the billionaire's wealth, yet never once had he envied it. Instead, he had learned to value dignity, kindness, and sacrifice. The first hours of the trial were filled with arguments about deeds and documents. Alexander's lawyers presented polished statements, pointing to maps and papers that made the land dispute seem indisputable. Grace's lawyer, overworked and underpaid, struggled to keep up. To the casual observer, it appeared hopeless. Alexander's case was airtight, his evidence flawless, his confidence unshakable. But something stirred in the courtroom as the judge asked if there was anything Grace's side wanted to add. Before closing statements, Grace lowered her head, her voice trembling as she whispered to her lawyer. He hesitated, then nodded, and slowly turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "Grace's son wishes to speak." A ripple of surprise swept through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow but allowed it, and so Isaiah stood. The boy rose from his chair, his frame slender but steady. The courtroom fell silent, curious about what a teenager could possibly contribute to a legal battle of this magnitude. Alexander leaned back in his seat, a smirk curling at his lips, as though the boy's presence was nothing more than a sideshow. But Isaiah's steady gaze silenced even him. The boy walked to the center of the courtroom, his shoes worn and scuffed against the polished floor. He faced the judge, then the crowd, his voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each word. He didn't speak of deeds or property laws. He spoke of nights when his mother worked until dawn, only to come home and make sure he had breakfast. He spoke of the cottage not as a house, but as a sanctuary, the only place that carried memories of his father, the place where laughter had somehow survived poverty. He described how his mother had spent Years cleaning rooms she could never dream of living in, polishing floors that sparkled for guests who never learned her name. Yet she had never complained. She had always taught him to be grateful, to study, to believe that hard work could give dignity even when the world denied them wealth. Every word struck deeper than any lawyer's argument could. The judge leaned forward, the jury sat straighter, and even the reporters lowered their pens, listening intently. Isaiah's voice was no longer the voice of a boy. It was the voice of every child who had grown up in the shadows of men like Alexander. Alexander shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time in years, he felt something foreign unease. He had walked into court expecting to crush an old woman with the weight of his power. Instead, he was being confronted by a truth he could not buy, a truth spoken through the trembling, but unbreakable voice of a boy who had nothing but dignity. And then Isaiah turned his gaze directly toward Alexander. The room seemed to hold its breath. His words, heavy with unspoken history, were about to fall, words that would shake the courtroom and pierce even the billionaire's guarded heart. The judge's eyes glistened. The audience leaned forward, and in that moment, as Isaiah opened his mouth, the weight of 2 decades of silence prepared to pour out. The courtroom held its silence as Isaiah stood tall, his young voice rising above the heavy air of tension. He turned fully toward Alexander, and for the first time, the billionaire could not avoid his gaze. Isaiah spoke of memories his mother had never shared openly, pieces of a past that had only emerged in fragments, whispered on late nights when she thought her son was asleep. He told the court how his mother had worked for Alexander not just as a maid, but as a caretaker when he was young. She had raised him in the quiet corners of his childhood. The hands that cleaned his toys were the same, that had cooked his meals when his parents were away, the same that had comforted him when he cried. But as Alexander grew into wealth and power, he had erased those memories. To him, Grace became invisible, just a servant in the background of his empire. Yet to Grace, every sacrifice had been real. She had given her youth, her strength, her patience, and her heart so that he could grow into the man he became. Isaiah's words cut deep. He painted a picture of a boy raised by a woman who never stopped giving, a woman who was discarded the moment her labor was no longer needed. He reminded the courtroom that Grace's cottage wasn't just 4 walls. It was the last living link to his father, a man who had once worked on the same estate until his life was cut short in an accident. That cottage carried the only family history Isaiah had, and to strip it away was to strip away his very identity. The judge shifted in his seat, his hands tightening on the bench. His face betrayed the struggle of a man trying to remain impartial while being moved by the raw humanity before him. The reporters who had come for spectacle found their eyes stinging with tears they hadn't expected. And then came the moment that silenced even Alexander's smirk. Isaiah took a breath, steadied himself, and revealed a truth that had remained buried for years. He told the court that his mother had once been more than just Alexander's maid. She had been his protector, his shield during nights when his parents' marriage had collapsed under the weight of money and ambition. She had been the one who stood by him when he felt abandoned, the one who whispered to him that he was loved when no one else bothered to say it. And then Isaiah's voice cracked as he revealed the part that made the room gasp. His mother had not only cared for Alexander, she had hidden a secret. That the man who had died working on Alexander's estate, Isaiah's father, had once been Alexander's closest friend before wealth drove them apart. His father's loyalty had been repaid with neglect, and Grace's loyalty had been repaid with invisibility. Tears finally pooled in Isaiah's eyes, but his words were steady. "This cottage," he said softly, "isn't just a home. It is the last place where my father's laughter still lingers. It is the only place where my mother's sacrifices still breathe. And it is proof that even the smallest lives matter, even in the shadow of a man who owns everything." The silence that followed was unbearable. The judge wiped at his eyes discreetly, but the emotion on his face was undeniable. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, some swallowing hard as if trying to contain their own tears. Even the court clerk stared down at her papers, blinking furiously to keep her composure. And Alexander, for the first time in his life, the billionaire's armor cracked. The man who had built skyscrapers, who had crushed competitors, who had buried empathy beneath boardroom deals, now sat exposed. His eyes flickered not with rage, but with something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt. He remembered suddenly the little boy he once was, the nights Grace had held his hand when fear crept into his dreams. He remembered the laughter of the man who had worked beside his family, Isaiah's father, a man he had abandoned in pursuit of fortune. The courtroom waited for him to respond, but Alexander had no words. His silence spoke louder than any defense. The judge finally cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he delivered his ruling. He declared that the cottage would remain with Grace, protected by law. He reminded the courtroom that justice was not only about property and power, but about humanity, dignity, and memory. His voice broke as he said it, leaving no doubt that Isaiah's words had pierced him deeply. Reporters rushed to capture every moment, but no headline could capture the atmosphere in that room. It wasn't a legal battle anymore. It was a reckoning, a reminder that wealth can build walls, but truth has the power to tear them down. As the gavel struck, Grace clutched Isaiah's hand, tears streaming freely down her face. She hadn't wanted a battle. She had only wanted a home. And now, through the voice of her son, she had been seen, not as a maid, not as a servant, but as a mother, a woman, and a human being. Alexander remained seated long after the courtroom emptied. He stared at the wooden bench in front of him, his empire suddenly feeling hollow. For once, he understood that all the money in the world could not erase the weight of a boy's. Truth spoken in a trembling voice. Outside, Isaiah and Grace walked together into the sunlight, their hands tightly clasped. The cameras flashed, people whispered, but none of it mattered. What mattered was that for the first time, their story had been told, and it had changed everything. And somewhere deep in his heart, the billionaire knew the boy was right. Wealth could buy land, it could buy power, but it could never buy back the tears of a mother or the dignity of a son who stood unafraid in a courtroom. The judge's tears had not been in vain. They had been the tears of truth, the tears of justice, the tears that reminded the world that even the most powerful can be humbled by the smallest voices. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories, and comment down from where you are watching this video.